The morning began like any other in the quiet neighborhood at the edge of Willow Creek, a place where life moved slowly and people still greeted each other by name. The sun had just risen, spreading a soft golden light over the houses, the cracked pavements, and the patches of grass that struggled to grow between them. Birds chirped in the distance, and the usual peaceful silence settled over the streets. But on this particular morning, something felt different. Something unsettled the gentle calm of Willow Creek. Something so small, so fragile, that most people would have missed it completely. Yet for anyone who listened closely enough, there was a faint, trembling sound drifting on the breeze. It wasn't the cry of a child, nor the noise of a bird. It was thinner, weaker, almost like a broken whimper carried by the wind. Most people walked past it without even noticing, too distracted with their routines. But to someone with a kind heart, someone who paid attention to the world and its silent suffering, that sound was impossible to ignore. That someone was Mrs. Lane, a gentle elderly woman with silver hair tied into a loose bun and a habit of feeding every stray animal she met. Her mornings always began with the same routine. She prepared a small bag of dry food, filled a bottle with water, and took her slow walk toward the abandoned lots where stray cats often gathered. Over the years, she had come to understand the difference between the sounds of hunger, pain, and fear in animals. But today, even she paused on her porch, confused. The sound she heard was faint, shaky, and so heartbreaking that it made her chest tighten. She stood still, leaning on her walking stick, trying to determine where it came from. It wasn't near her house. It wasn't coming from the usual alley where the cats stayed either. Instead, it echoed softly from behind the old abandoned shed 3 houses down, an area she rarely visited because it was usually empty and overgrown. The sound came again, a thin, desperate squeak, a cry for help. Her heart skipped. She tightened her grip on her stick and hurried as fast as her tired legs allowed. Each step made the sound louder, but still so terribly soft it felt like it might disappear at any moment. Mrs. Lane pushed aside a tall cluster of weeds, her shoes brushing through dried leaves scattered across the ground. The shed loomed in front of her, its wooden panels aged and peeling, its roof crooked from years of neglect. She took a deep breath, stepped toward the back of the shed, and listened again. And there it was, the heartbreaking sound, clearer now. A tiny cry, a whimper of pure desperation, a life begging not to be forgotten. She knelt slowly, using one hand to steady herself, and moved aside a broken piece of wood leaning against the shed wall. Behind it sat a small, torn shoebox. At first she thought it had been thrown there by someone cleaning up old trash. But the moment she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. Inside the box, curled in the tiniest ball she had ever seen, was a newborn puppy, so impossibly small she could almost mistake him for a mouse. His fur was thin and patchy, his ribs visible beneath his delicate skin. His eyes were half closed, barely able to stay open, and his tiny chest rose and fell in weak, uneven breaths. The puppy let out another faint squeak, his body trembling from cold and fear. Mrs. Lane's voice broke as she whispered, "Oh, you poor little baby, who did this to you?" She reached into the box, and the puppy, though weak, tried to lift his head toward her hand. Even in his fragile state, he was still seeking warmth, comfort, and a chance to live. That one small movement shook her deeply. She had seen many abandoned animals, but never something this tiny, this helpless, this close to slipping away forever. Someone had left him here deliberately. The shoebox was too intentional, tucked behind the shed where no one would easily find it. The thought made her heart ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. Tears filled her eyes, and she gently scooped the puppy into her hands. He was lighter than a feather, almost weightless, as if it could vanish with one breath of wind. The puppy tried to nuzzle into her palm, seeking heat his frail body could no longer produce. His breathing hitched, and his small paws twitched weakly. Mrs. Lane could feel his bones through his skin, and the realization terrified her. Time was running out. She had no medical expertise, but she knew one thing. This puppy would not survive another hour without help. Her hands trembled as she wrapped him inside her scarf, close to her chest to share her body warmth. She stood up slowly, clutching him protectively, and turned toward the veterinary clinic at the end of the street. She didn't bother locking her house. Didn't worry about her morning chores. Didn't think about her aching joints or the long walk ahead. The only thing that mattered now was the fragile life in her arms. Her steps were hurried, driven by urgency she hadn't felt in years. As she walked, she whispered soft words into the scarf, telling the tiny puppy to hold on, to stay awake, to keep breathing. The puppy responded with a tiny stir, as if he understood. People on the street watched her pass, confused by the panic on her face. But she didn't stop to explain. She just kept walking, faster, then faster still, until she finally reached the clinic's glass doors. She pushed them open, breathless, and called out for help. And that single moment, the moment she chose not to ignore the faint cry behind the shed, became the beginning of a story that would change many lives, including the smallest one of all. Inside the small veterinary clinic, the atmosphere was usually calm, filled with soft music and the gentle buzz of machines. But that morning, everything changed the moment Mrs. Lane pushed open the door, her face pale with worry and her arms trembling as she cradled the tiny bundle wrapped inside her scarf. The receptionist, a young woman named Clara, immediately noticed something was wrong. She stood up from her desk, concern written all over her face as she hurried toward Mrs. Lane. The older woman didn't waste a second explaining. She simply opened her scarf slightly, revealing the fragile, shivering puppy. Clara gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand in shock. Without hesitation, she called out for Dr. Carter, the head veterinarian who had saved countless animals and was known for his deep compassion. Within seconds, the doctor emerged from the examination room, wiping his hands on a towel. He saw the fear on Mrs. Lane's face and rushed toward her. She carefully handed him the tiny creature, and the moment the puppy touched his palms, something inside him shifted. He had seen weak animals before, newborns with complications, and injured strays barely clinging to life. But never in his entire career had he held something so heartbreakingly fragile. The puppy felt almost weightless, his body colder than it should have been, and his breathing shallow and uneven. Dr. Carter's professional experience instantly kicked in. With quick steps, he led them to the emergency table and began examining the tiny pup with a mix of urgency and gentleness. He placed the puppy under a warm lamp, checked his pulse, listened to his heartbeat, and carefully inspected his limbs. As he worked, his face shifted from confusion to concern, and then to something much deeper, shock. Mrs. Lane watched him closely, her hands clasped together, her heart pounding. She could see something wasn't right, but she didn't dare interrupt him. Meanwhile, Claire prepared warm fluids, small syringes, and a heating pad, placing everything within the doctor's reach. The clinic suddenly felt tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. After several long minutes, Dr. Carter finally spoke, his voice heavy with disbelief. He explained that the puppy was not simply cold or hungry. He was in an extremely severe condition. The tiny creature was drastically underweight, far below even the smallest runt of a litter. His bones were visible through his skin, and his muscles were barely developed. The puppy hadn't been fed properly for days, perhaps longer. He was dehydrated to a dangerous level, and his tiny blood pressure was incredibly low. When Dr. Carter gently moved the puppy's head, he noticed faint bruises that shouldn't have been there. He examined the neck more closely and found small, thin marks, evidence that the little one might have been tied or restrained with something. This discovery made the doctor freeze for a moment, his eyes darkening with sadness and anger. He couldn't understand how anyone could cause harm to a creature this tiny, this defenseless, this innocent. As Dr. Carter continued examining the puppy, he felt the tiny paw grip his glove weakly, as if begging him to save his life. That simple gesture struck him deeply. In his career, he had often felt the silent communication of animals, their quiet trust or fear, their hope or despair. But this was different. The puppy was fighting, even in his weakest moment. He was holding on, refusing to let go. It was as if he understood that he was finally in the hands of someone who wouldn't abandon him. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, trying to stay composed, but Mrs. Lane could see the emotion building in his eyes. She stepped closer and gently rested her hand on his arm, asking softly if the puppy would survive. Dr. Carter didn't give an immediate answer. Instead, he took a deep, steadying breath, placed the puppy gently inside a warm incubator, and continued monitoring his vitals. Then, in a low voice filled with both heartbreak and determination, he explained the truth. The puppy's condition was not natural. It was a result of severe neglect, perhaps even abandonment. He told Mrs. Lane that the puppy had likely been separated from his mother far too early, maybe only a few days after birth. Without a mother's warmth, milk, or protection, the newborn had no chance of surviving on his own. Someone had intentionally left him alone, weak and defenseless. The bruises and marks suggested he might have been mishandled or thrown aside because he was too small. As the doctor spoke, each word fell heavier than the last. Tears gathered in Mrs. Lane's eyes, and she covered her mouth, devastated that any human could treat a newborn puppy like this. Clara, standing at the corner of the room, wiped her eyes discreetly. She had worked in the clinic long enough to see heartbreaking cases, but this one felt personal. Perhaps it was the puppy's size, or the way he cried so softly, or the fact that he'd been fighting to be found even when he could barely breathe. The entire clinic seemed to absorb the emotional weight of the moment. Dr. Carter, however, refused to give in to despair. His voice grew firm as he promised Mrs. Lane that he would do everything in his power to save the tiny life lying before them. He ordered Clara to prepare special nutrient fluids suitable for newborn pups and adjusted the incubator's temperature to mimic a mother dog's warmth. He gently touched the puppy's head again, whispering encouraging words under his breath. He knew the fight ahead would be difficult, but he also knew the puppy had a spark of survival inside him, a spark worth protecting. As Mrs. Lane stood watching, she couldn't help recalling the moment she found the puppy behind the shed. His weak cry had been so small, yet so full of meaning. It felt as though fate had guided her toward him, urging her to follow that heartbreaking sound. She realized now that if she had ignored it, if she had delayed even a few more minutes, this tiny life might have slipped away forever. Her heart felt heavy, but it also felt full of hope. The puppy was now in safe hands. Hands that understood his pain and cared enough to fight for him. Dr. Carter looked at the puppy one last time before beginning the treatment, and in that moment, he felt a deep connection. The puppy's story was still unknown, but one thing was clear. This little survivor had endured unimaginable hardship, and yet he still fought to live. That courage touched the doctor's heart in a way he hadn't expected. And without saying out loud, he made a silent promise to the fragile life before him. He would not give up, not now, not ever. The hours that followed were some of the longest Dr. Carter had experienced in a long time. After placing the tiny puppy, now resting inside the incubator in a bundle of soft blankets, Dr. Carter carefully monitored every small change in his breathing, every twitch of his paws, and every flicker of his eyelids. The warm light inside the incubator reflected off the puppy's fragile body, giving him a faint glow that made him look even smaller than he already was. Mrs. Lane sat quietly nearby on a small chair, her hands clasped tightly together, while her eyes remained fixed on the incubator. She felt responsible for the little dog's life now, as if it had been placed directly into her heart the moment she found him behind the shed. Clara moved gently around the room, preparing supplies whenever the doctor asked, trying not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the clinic. Every person in that room felt as if they were holding their breath, waiting for the tiniest sign of improvement. Dr. Carter's mind, however, was far from peaceful. He couldn't stop thinking about the wounds, the bruises, and the marks he had found on the puppy's delicate neck. They were too precise, too unnatural to have been caused by any accident. As he studied the pup's tiny frame, he realized that each mark told a story of suffering, of abandonment, and of careless cruelty. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone leave such a helpless newborn alone behind a shed in a torn shoebox? Why would someone separate a baby from its mother before it even had a chance to grow? Questions he couldn't answer swirled inside his mind. Something about the puppy's past didn't add up, and the more he thought about it, the more determined he became to uncover the truth. He knew he couldn't ignore these signs. This wasn't simply a case of a stray pup. This was something darker. After several quiet minutes, he began speaking softly, explaining what he had discovered during the examination. Mrs. Lane listened with wide, tear-filled eyes as he detailed the signs of long-term neglect. The puppy was far too small for his age, meaning he had not been fed properly or regularly. The dehydration suggested he had been without water for a dangerous amount of time. The bruises and neck marks were indicators of rough handling. Someone had clearly not wanted to care for him. Yet, through all this pain, the puppy still fought for every breath. That alone amazed the doctor. He had seen strong animals give up in less severe conditions, but this little one seemed determined to cling to life despite everything done to him. As they talked, the puppy gave a faint twitch in the incubator, and all three heads turned toward him. His tiny chest rose and fell more steadily now, though still weak. Dr. Carter gently opened the incubator door, checking his temperature and adjusting the heating settings. The puppy let out a soft whimper, a sound so small it almost blended with the hum of the machine. But to the people watching, it was a sign that he was still fighting, and that gave them hope. Once the doctor closed the incubator again, he continued examining the puppy's medical chart. With every piece of information he added weight, heartbeat, strength, body temperature. He became more certain that the puppy's past had not been just neglect, but something closer to intentional abandonment. It was a thought that made him clench his jaw in silent frustration. Mrs. Lane finally found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Do you think someone left him there on purpose?" Her voice trembled slightly, filled with dread. Dr. Carter paused, looking at her with gentle honesty. He didn't want to frighten her, but he also didn't want to hide the truth. He explained that the signs pointed toward deliberate abandonment. The shoebox wasn't a random place. It had been placed behind the shed where no one walked often. The marks on the puppy's body suggested someone had attempted to handle him roughly. And given his size, smaller than any puppy should naturally be, he may have been rejected or deemed worthless by someone who saw him as nothing more than a burden. As Mrs. Lane absorbed this painful reality, she closed her eyes, shaking her head slowly. Her heart broke at the thought that the tiny creature had been thrown away like something unwanted. She remembered his desperate cry that morning, how it had echoed softly through the air, begging her to come closer. She couldn't believe how close he had been to being lost forever. Clara stepped closer to the incubator, whispering how unfair it was that animals suffered because of humans who didn't value them. Dr. Carter agreed silently as he stood, watching the puppy sleep. The little one's survival was nothing short of a miracle, but his story was far from over. The doctor decided he needed more information. Someone in the neighborhood might know about a recent litter, or might have seen suspicious behavior. Maybe there were clues around the shed that he had missed. He couldn't help but feel that this wasn't an isolated incident. Puppies didn't just appear in shoeboxes behind sheds without a reason. Someone had put him there. Someone who didn't want the responsibility or didn't care enough to find help. Dr. Carter made mental notes of everything, determined to uncover any detail that would explain what the puppy had endured before that morning. He knew he had to be cautious, but he also knew he couldn't let the truth stay hidden. Meanwhile, the puppy stirred again. His tiny paw moved slightly as if searching for warmth or comfort. Mrs. Lane immediately moved closer to the glass window of the incubator. Despite his weak state, the little dog lifted his head for a short second before resting it back down. That small movement felt like a message that he was still here, still trying, still holding on. And in that moment, something changed in the room. The fear and sadness that filled the air slowly turned into determination. The hidden truth of his past might have been painful, but the future could be different. Dr. Carter stood up straighter, his eyes filled with renewed purpose. He was no longer just treating a sick puppy. He was fighting for a life that had been mistreated, discarded, and nearly lost forever. He gently touched the incubator door, whispering a quiet promise that he would uncover the truth and give the tiny warrior the life he deserved. In that quiet room filled with beeping machines, soft lights, and the steady rhythm of the puppy's breath, a new chapter began. One that will reveal secrets no one expected and test the strength of everyone involved. The next several days inside the veterinary clinic felt like a long, exhausting battle, a battle that none of them had prepared for. Yet all of them were determined to fight. From the moment the tiny puppy was placed inside the incubator, Dr. Carter knew that saving him would not be a simple task. The puppy's weak body had already endured more suffering than many adult animals experience in a lifetime, and the road to recovery would be unpredictable, filled with dangerous ups and downs. But the little pups will to survive became the quiet heartbeat of the clinic, inspiring everyone who walked through the door. Even patients waiting for routine checkups would stop and ask about the tiny fighter they saw wrapped in blankets inside the incubator. His presence brought something special into the clinic, a mixture of hope, fear, and deep compassion that touched every corner of the room. Dr. Carter barely slept during this period. He set up a small chair next to the incubator and worked late into the night, reviewing medical books, preparing nutritional mixtures, and monitoring the puppy's progress hour by hour. Every so often, the puppy's breathing would become shallow, or he would suddenly become still, making the doctor's heart race in fear that he was slipping away. Then, after a few minutes, the puppy would twitch his tiny paws or release a faint cry, reassuring everyone that he was still with them, still fighting. These moments created an emotional roller coaster, where relief and panic followed each other so rapidly that even the experienced veterinarian felt mentally drained. But no matter how tired he grew, Dr. Carter refused to leave the little one's side for more than a few minutes. On the second night, something happened that made him realize just how fragile the puppy's condition truly was. Around midnight, the puppy's temperature dropped unexpectedly, and his breathing became dangerously slow. Dr. Carter jumped up from his chair, adjusting the incubator heat, massaging the puppy's tiny body to stimulate circulation, and giving him microdoses of warm glucose solution. For a frightening moment, the pup didn't respond at all. The room was silent except for the softened machines and the doctor's hurried breathing. Clara, who stayed late to help, stood by the doorway watching with her hands over her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. Just when the fear reached its peak, the puppy let out a small but clear gasp of air and moved his little legs weakly. A wave of relief washed through the room, and Dr. Carter exhaled deeply, feeling his knees turn weak from the emotional shock. He whispered, "You're not giving up, are you?" As if the puppy understood every word. By the morning, the puppy stabilized again, proving once more that he had a spirit far stronger than his tiny body suggested. When Mrs. Lane arrived, carrying fresh blankets she had sewn just for him, she listened to night's events with a mixture of heartbreak and admiration. She gently pressed her palm against the incubator's glass, whispering words of comfort to the little one. She told him how proud she was, how brave he had been, and how he was not alone anymore. The puppy, though weak, lifted his head slightly when he heard her voice, and that simple response filled the room with a warmth no heater could ever provide. Mrs. Lane wiped her eyes, realizing how deeply attached she'd become to the small life she found behind the shed. It wasn't just pity or sadness. It was something more powerful, a protective love that wrapped around her heart like a shield. Over the next few days, the puppy's condition seemed to move in small steps, sometimes forward, sometimes backward. There were mornings when Dr. Carter would enter the clinic feeling hopeful because the pup had taken a few drops of formula the night before. On those mornings, the puppy would appear slightly stronger, moving his tiny paws as if trying to explore his soft bedding. But there were also mornings when the doctor would find him lying too still or refusing to drink, and the fear of losing him would rise again like a heavy cloud weighing on everyone's chest. Yet through every setback, the puppy refused to let go. His resilience became a constant reminder of why they were fighting so hard. The clinic staff unofficially named him Hope, a name that everyone found fitting. Though Dr. Carter initially thought naming him might be too soon, even risky, given how fragile he still was, he eventually embraced it. Hope became more than just a puppy's name. It became a symbol that filled the clinic with strength. Whenever a difficult moment came, someone would say, "Hope can do this," and suddenly the weight in the room felt lighter. Clients who came to the clinic began asking for updates. Someone even brought a small basket of soft towels embroidered with the word "Hope," wanting to show support. The tiny puppy had somehow brought the whole community together without even leaving the incubator. Despite the love and care surrounding him, the fight continued daily. His digestive system was delicate. Sometimes he couldn't keep food down. His heartbeat remained irregular and needed constant monitoring. Even small noises could frighten him because his body was still recovering from trauma. Yet there was something extraordinary about the way Hope looked at the people caring for him. When Dr. Carter leaned close, the puppy's eyes, though tired and slow, seemed to follow him, as if recognizing the man who refused to give up on him. When Mrs. Lane spoke softly, Hope would make small movements, trying to respond. And whenever Clara placed a warm blanket around him, he would nuzzle into it with a comfort that brought tears to her eyes. Through all this, Dr. Carter found himself thinking more and more about the cruelty Hope had endured before arriving at the clinic. The marks on his neck, the bruises, the abandonment, all of it painted a picture so painful that the doctor struggled to let it go. He knew that someone out there had made a choice to leave this puppy to die. Someone had looked at this tiny life and decided it wasn't worth saving. That thought pushed him to work even harder, refusing to allow their cruelty to define Hope's story. If the world had been unfair to him before, then Dr. Carter and everyone at the clinic would make sure the world became kinder from this point forward. As the fourth day came to an end, Dr. Carter sat beside the incubator with tired eyes, but a hopeful heart. Hope slept with a little more strength now, his breathing a little deeper, his tiny body warmer than it had been since the day he arrived. The fight was far from over, but each small victory gave him the strength to keep going. Hope had shown them that even the smallest creature, even the weakest heart, could fight with unimaginable courage. And as night fell over Willow Creek, the tiny puppy rested peacefully, surrounded by warmth, love, and the unwavering determination of the people who refused to let him slip away. As Hope slowly began to regain a little strength day by day, the atmosphere in the clinic shifted from constant fear to cautious optimism. His tiny heartbeat grew steadier, his body warmer, and his eyes, though still tired, began to open more fully, revealing small sparks of curiosity beneath the weakness. Yet even with these positive signs, something weighed heavily on Dr. Carter's mind. The mystery of Hope's past, the unanswered questions about how he ended up abandoned behind a shed in a torn shoebox, continued to trouble him. The bruises, the marks on his neck, the extreme malnourishment, none of these were accidental. Someone had made choices that put this newborn in danger, and although the doctor's main focus was saving Hope's fragile life, he couldn't simply ignore the cruelty behind the story. Still, he kept these thoughts quietly inside him, not wanting to burden Mrs. Lane or the clinic staff with more sadness, while Hope was still fighting to survive. It was on the 7th morning after Hope's rescue that everything changed. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the clinic's front door opened, and a young teenage boy stepped inside. He looked nervous, shifting uncomfortably as he approached the reception desk. Clara greeted him warmly, but also with curiosity, as she noticed how he kept glancing toward the back rooms where the incubator was kept. The boy hesitated before speaking, his voice low and uncertain. He explained that he was looking for a puppy, a very small puppy from a litter born in his neighborhood. Clara listened closely, surprised by the sudden relevance of his question. She asked him to wait for a moment and rushed to get Dr. Carter, feeling that something important was about to be revealed. When Dr. Carter stepped into the reception area, the young boy's expression shifted from nervousness to guilt. He had come looking for the smallest puppy of a litter belonging to a local backyard breeder. According to the boy, the breeder believed only strong, healthy puppies were worth keeping. The smallest of the litter, Hope, had been considered a burden. The breeder claimed the puppy would die anyway because he was too tiny, too weak, and not worth the time or care. Hearing this, Dr. Carter felt a deep, sinking pressure in his chest. He asked where the puppy had been kept before he went missing. The boy explained that the breeder had left the tiny pup outside behind an old shed, so he would go on his own quietly. The words hit Dr. Carter like a blow. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, even though every part of him felt shaken. Mrs. Lane, who had just arrived to check on Hope, overheard the conversation and immediately felt tears rising in her eyes. She stared at the boy, horrified, as he continued explaining that he had secretly checked on the puppy early every morning because he felt sorry for him. But one day, the puppy was gone. He assumed another animal had taken him, or that he had finally died. The boy's voice cracked as he said he hadn't slept well since then, haunted by uncertainty about what had happened to the tiny creature he couldn't save on his own. Dr. Carter took a deep breath before gently telling the boy that the puppy was alive. The boy's eyes widened with disbelief, and tears spilled down his cheeks when he heard that Mrs. Lane had found the newborn crying behind the shed and brought him to the clinic just in time. The boy looked overwhelmed with relief and guilt, apologizing repeatedly for not being brave enough to confront the breeder or take the puppy himself. Dr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, telling him that he had done the right thing by coming forward now. The doctor's voice, steady but emotionally charged, explained that the puppy had endured severe malnutrition, dehydration, and trauma, but he was fighting incredibly hard to survive. Then, as if unable to hold back any longer, Dr. Carter confessed that he had suspected something terrible from the moment he first examined Hope. The marks, the condition, the location, all pointed toward neglect, abandonment, and cruelty. Hearing the truth spoken aloud made Mrs. Lane cover her mouth in shock, and tears rolled down her cheeks as she realized the depth of suffering the tiny puppy had experienced. She remembered the moment she found him shivering and crying in the shoebox, and her heart broke all over again knowing someone had intentionally left him there to die. She looked toward the incubator room, imagining Hope's tiny body curled in a dark corner behind a shed, invisible to the world and unwanted by the person meant to protect him. Dr. Carter walked the boy to the incubator and gently opened the door to let him see Hope. The puppy, though still weak, moved slightly when he sensed the light shift. His tiny chest rose and fell slowly, and his little paws twitched as if reaching for warmth. The boy wiped his tears and whispered an apology to Hope, promising quietly that he had tried his best and that he had always hoped someone kind would find him. Dr. Carter watched the moment unfold with a heavy heart. The truth was painful, but also provided clarity. Hope had survived the darkest part of his story because somewhere deep inside him there was a spark of fight, a will that refused to die. The doctor then stood quietly beside the incubator for a long moment, feeling overwhelmed by a mixture of sadness, anger, and awe. He understood now, more than ever, why he had felt an emotional connection to the puppy from the very beginning. Hope's fight was not just physical. It was a battle against the cruelty of the world, a battle he never should have been forced to fight. Dr. Carter felt his throat tighten and his eyes sting, and though he tried to hold back, a tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. The boys saw it, Mrs. Lane saw it, and Clara saw it too, but none of them said a word. They all understood that the doctor wasn't crying out of weakness. He was crying because he cared deeply. That day marked a turning point in Hope's story. The truth was no longer hidden. It no longer lived quietly in the marks on his neck or the tremble in his breath. It was spoken aloud, acknowledged, and faced head-on. And although the truth was heartbreaking, it strengthened everyone's resolve to protect him, love him, and give him a future far better than his past. Hope had survived abandonment, cruelty, and death itself. Now, surrounded by people who cherish him, he was finally safe, truly safe. And for the first time since he was born, his story began to shift from tragedy toward healing. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet miracle unfolding inside the clinic, a transformation that everyone witnessed with a mixture of relief, awe, and deep affection. Hope, the tiniest puppy they had ever seen, slowly began to grow stronger. His once weak chest now rose and fell with steadier breaths, and his eyes, previously dull and half-closed, opened wider each day, revealing a gentle innocence untouched by the cruelty he had endured. Dr. Carter often stood by the incubator late at night, watching Hope stretch his tiny paws, attempting to stand, wobbling forward only to fall onto his blanket again. But each small attempt was a victory, proof that his spirit was stronger than his fragile body. The staff celebrated every new improvement, no matter how small. When Hope took his first tiny lick of kitten milk formula from a shallow dish, Clara clapped her hands with joy. When he let out his first proper puppy squeak after regaining a bit of strength, Mrs. Lane pressed her hands to her heart, tears filling her eyes. And when he finally managed to stand for more than a few seconds, Dr. Carter felt something lift inside him, a weight that had rested on his shoulders since the day Hope arrived. The little warrior had chosen life. It was impossible not to feel proud of his courage. Day by day, Hope grew a little bigger. His ribs, once so visible and sharp, began to soften under a layer of healthy flesh. His fur, which had been thin and patchy, now grew thicker, covering his tiny body in a soft golden coat that made him look like a little ball of sunlight. And though he was still much smaller than any normal puppy his age, his personality began to shine, a playful curiosity, a gentle nature, and a deep trust in the people who cared for him. He often tried to follow Dr. Carter around the room on shaky legs, bumping into walls or sliding across the tiles. But each time he fell, the doctor would scoop him up gently and place him back in the center of his warm blanket. Hope would look up at him with bright eyes, as if trying to say, "I'll try again." And he always did. Despite all this progress, Dr. Carter knew that Hope's journey wasn't complete until he found a real home, a family who would love him, protect him, and give him everything he had been denied from the moment he was born. Deep down, the doctor feared the day Hope would leave the clinic, because he had grown incredibly attached to the little pup. But he also knew that the clinic was not a forever home. Hope deserved something better, something filled with warmth, safety, and constant love. There was one person who visited Hope every single day, Mrs. Lane. From the moment she found him behind the shed, she had formed a bond with him that even Dr. Carter couldn't fully explain. She brought blankets she had knitted by hand, soft toys, and even read stories aloud to him during long evenings when the clinic was quiet. Hope recognized her voice instantly. Whenever she entered the room, his ears twitched and his tail, tiny but determined, wobbled excitedly. It was as if he knew she was the first person who ever cared for him, the first person who heard his cry when the world tried to silence it. She called him my brave boy, and every time Hope nuzzled into her palm, she cried softly, feeling overwhelmed by the miracle of his survival. One afternoon, after checking Hope's vitals, Dr. Carter watched him curl up against Mrs. Lane's chest as if he had found the safest place in the world. The puppy's head rested near her heart, his breathing slow and content. The doctor cleared his throat, fighting the emotion rising inside him. Then he asked softly, "Mrs. Lane, have you ever considered adopting him?" The question hung in the air, gentle but full of meaning. Mrs. Lane's eyes widened behind her glasses. For a moment she looked stunned, unable to speak as her mouth trembled. Tears filled her eyes before she finally whispered, "I would be honored if he wants me." At the sound of her trembling voice, Hope lifted his head and licked her chin gently in the smallest, sweetest gesture of love. Dr. Carter smiled then, a soft, emotional smile filled with relief. The answer was clear. Hope had chosen her long before the doctor ever asked the question. The adoption process was simple, but the moment was profound. When Dr. Carter placed the final form in front of her, Mrs. Lane signed it with hands that trembled from overwhelming joy. She held Hope close as if she feared losing him again, though she knew that this time, the little puppy was going exactly where he belonged. The entire clinic gathered around them, sharing in the emotional moment. Clara brought a small bow for Hope's collar, and one of the staff members snapped a photo of the newly formed family. Even the teenage boy who had first revealed the truth about Hope's past returned to say goodbye. He knelt beside the puppy, whispering how happy he was that Hope survived and promising to visit when he could. Before leaving the clinic, Mrs. Lane turned to Dr. Carter. Tears glistened in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you for saving him." Dr. Carter shook his head gently and replied, "He saved himself. I just helped him fight." He bent down, giving Hope one last gentle stroke on the head. "Take care, little warrior," he whispered. "You've earned your happy life." Hope leaned into his touch, his tiny tail wagging with pure gratitude. Then he curled peacefully in Mrs. Lane's arms as she carried him out of clinic and into his new life. The walk back to her home felt different from the day she found him behind the shed. Back then, he had been a trembling, nearly lifeless newborn begging for help with the smallest cry. Now he was warm, safe, and surrounded by love. As she stepped inside her cozy living room, she placed Hope in a soft bed she had prepared beside the fireplace. He looked around, sniffed the blankets, and then settled down, curling into a fluffy ball as if he finally understood what safety felt like. Mrs. Lane knelt by him, whispering, "You are home now, my brave little miracle." And in that peaceful home, with the sunlight warming the walls and the quiet hum of life surrounding him, Hope finally closed his eyes, not from weakness this time, but from comfort. For the first time since he came into this world, he slept not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. The smallest puppy they had ever seen had survived the impossible. He had fought darkness, cruelty, and fear, and won. His story, once filled with pain and abandonment, had become a miracle, a testament to love, courage, and second chances. Hope had found a forever home, and in the end, he proved that even the tiniest life could carry the biggest heart.